Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg at St. Joan Antietam, a Catholic girls' high school in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Some of the young women walking the halls here are attending this religious school with the help of controversial publicly funded vouchers. This has prompted a vigorous debate both here in Wisconsin and around the country. Joining us to sort through the conflict and consensus are Paul Peterson, the director of the program on education policy and governance at Harvard University and co-author of Effectiveness of School Choice, the Milwaukee Experiment. And Peter Cookson, the director of the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, and the author of Choosing Schools, Vouchers, and American Education. The sizzling argument about school vouchers strikes at the heart of the American way of life. Look, most Americans believe that public education, quality public education, has been a root of American greatness, helping forge disparate tribes into a great folk. Most Americans also believe that individualism has been a root of American greatness, that Americans are freer than any other people to choose the way they go about their business. Now, what happens when these two beliefs collide head on? Think Tank went to Milwaukee to try to find out. Milwaukee, Wisconsin is a city of 628,000 people, nestled against the shore of mighty Lake Michigan. As in many large cities, Milwaukee residents have become dissatisfied and disillusioned with their public schools. But unlike most cities, Milwaukee has done something about it.
I have parents here right now in the office that are interested in placing their children in the programs.
John Norquist is a Democrat and the mayor of Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
What happened in Milwaukee was that parents, particularly in the inner city, became so frustrated with the system that school choice became very popular. It was a grassroots movement led by Polly Williams, who is an African-American state representative from part of the inner city of Milwaukee.
The state of Wisconsin and its big city Milwaukee have become famous and infamous for a controversial publicly funded voucher program. These vouchers, worth about $5,000, help low-income families send their kids to private schools, including religious schools. Opponents of the program have challenged it in the courts.
Rather, the constitutional issue for the court is whether the state of Wisconsin can use state funds to pay for that religious education.
But the United States Supreme Court recently declined to hear a challenge to the program, ensuring its survival in Wisconsin. And as choice programs continue to pop up around the country and become more popular with parents, the stakes are rising. Some worry that voucher programs bleed money from the public school systems, which they feel are already underfunded. Supporters counter that vouchers can liberate students trapped in troubled schools and make those public schools better as they are forced to compete.
Is the primary effect to get money to religious schools? No. That's not what it's about. It is to give these children an opportunity and then for that dynamic of competition to occur.
And if parents want it, so the argument goes, why not give it to them? Peter Cookson, Paul Peterson, welcome. Peter, are publicly funded vouchers the answer?
No, they're not for public education. I think there are things that we can learn by competition, and I'm certainly for school choice. But I think the idea of taking public funds and giving them to private schools is basically a flawed idea. Secondly, I don't think that's what American people want. They want strong public schools that are community schools, that are democratically governed. That's what they want. And lastly, I think there's very little evidence that markets operate in the way some of their advocates argue.
Paul.
We are finding that kids are learning more in private schools. They're low-income kids living in our central cities are making more money, are learning more and will eventually make more money based on this by having a chance to go to a private school. And I think we need to open up as many opportunities for low-income kids in our central cities as possible.
What percentage of the American school children now go to private schools?
10, 11%.
That's right.
Now, in your nightmare scenario, suppose you had not only a variety of cities and states, but say the federal government today we're going to give you
Right.
$1,000.
Right.
What would that 11% figure rise to?
Well, I think you'd see an expansion of the private sector. I think many of these schools would be franchise schools, not the little mom and pop schools, wonderful creative little centers. Probably the actual capacity at this point couldn't be more than 5 or 6%. It might grow over a period of 10 years to 25 or 35%. I could see that.
So you'd still have, in nightmare scenario number one, you would still have 70% of the children in public schools. Instead of 90, you'd have 70.
But here's how it would look, I think.
Right.
First off, I think that suburban schools would remain public because I think they would. I think a lot of rural schools would remain.
Because they're working pretty well.
So it would be sort of socialism for the rich, but I think there'd be markets for the poor. And there's where I think you'd get a huge kind of fragmentation of the system. With very little accountability.
Actually, Peter, it's the opposite. We have markets for the rich right now. The rich can buy out of the public schools, go send their kids to private schools, or they can move to suburbs, fancy suburbs, where they can have very special schools built for them. And they have lots of choice out there. It's the poor kids who live in our central cities. They're the ones who have the monopoly to deal with. They're the ones that Norquist is talking about. Now, if you take Norquist's vision and say, okay, let's give the kids living in the center of our big American cities a chance to go to whatever school they want to go to, doesn't this have a possibility of reviving our central cities?
We know what makes good schools in central cities, and there are lots of examples of how to make public schools work in the central cities. To destroy this effort by fragmenting it and giving it to all these private vendors is really unfair to these kids. It really is. There are lots of examples, and there's lots of research which demonstrates what makes a good school. And therefore, the argument that somehow destroying these schools and giving the money to private schools doesn't make any sense to me.
You're talking about evidence that public schools work, and you're talking about evidence that private voucher schools work. Let's go 1, 2. Tell me.
In New York City,
okay.
we said, okay, what's the difference between going to a public school and going to a private school? We think it's the best designed study that's ever been done on this subject. And we find out that low-income minority kids in private schools go to more integrated schools, schools that are smaller, schools that have smaller class sizes, schools that have less disruption in the classroom by tardiness or fighting or cheating, all the kinds of usual problems that are affecting our big city public schools, and that there's more communication with parents. So there's a whole range of factors. We know what good schools are, and we know that the private schools in New York City are already doing that. Why should we not take advantage of that?
This experiment was privately funded vouchers used as if they were publicly funded vouchers. You picked a sample of kids from the inner city and said, you can use this voucher to go to a private school of your choice. Is that basically what it was? I mean,
this happened last year.
We went up and we went up and filmed that when it was going on in New York, and that was quite impressive, actually.
Well, what happened is over 20,000 kids applied for a scholarship. They only had about 1,500, little less. And so they gave out about that many, and then the kids that didn't get the scholarship became part of our control group. So we compared those who got in with those who didn't get in. It was a lottery that decided it, so it was a nice experiment kind of situation. And we found out 1 year later the test scores of the kids in the 4th and 5th grades go up 4 percentile points in reading, 6 percentile points in math, which is pretty big increase. If you start doing that over the lifetime of the child, by the time they graduate from high school, these minority kids are going to be doing as well as white kids are today.
What's wrong with that?
Well, there's a lot to be learned from Paul's research. I think small schools, I think schools that have discipline, which have high quality curriculum and teachers. I think that's what we know in public education as well. There's lots of public schools where have some of these characteristics that Paul has mentioned that also have raised the scores, have also improved the learning opportunities for children. It's not a public-private phenomenon. That's really a basic error. It really has to do with the way schools are governed, whether they're public or private, the resources that are put into them, and the qualities of the teachers.
But wait a minute, Peter. The public schools, and I came up through the public school system. I think it's you know, the greatest thing since sliced bread when it works. But the fact is, you now have at least two major bureaucracies making it difficult. One is the governmental bureaucracy, and one is the union bureaucracy. Now, I'm not against government. I'm not against unions. I'm certainly not against teachers' unions, because my daughter is the issues director of the American Federation of Teachers.
Yeah.
Now, however, those are, in some degree, stultifying effects on these schools. Why not give Paul a chance to get those bureaucracies to say, hey, we better shape up?
There was a story in the paper just this week which said, hey, a principal in a public school in New York City wants to put lockers in a classroom for the convenience of the students in that classroom. The unions objected because this would make administrators out of teachers for 5 minutes during the class period. Then another teacher wanted to have a chorus. Can't have a chorus because only 28 kids in a classroom. You can't have a chorus without 40 kids. No chorus. I mean, these are the kinds of ways that bureaucracies and unions are making it impossible to create. Yes, we know how to create good schools, but why haven't we created them in New York City? Why haven't we? When right next door is a private school that is creating these opportunities today. So you say it isn't public-private. Well, maybe not, but as it turns out, the private sector is able to do what the public sector seems unable to do in our central city.
Okay. All right.
Well, I think to respond to that, I think there's a lot of truth in this, that the urban schools have become highly bureaucratized, and the lack of freedom and autonomy by principals and so forth is a real issue, although I think some of the anecdotes that are raised are somewhat unfair. But fundamentally, this is a correct position. I think that we have to look very hard in, say, a place like New York, about what we're going to do about the governance. There's over, what, 1.4 million, 1.3 million kids. You cannot govern a system, a public school system that's that large. If we look at parental choice, and here's where it gets a little subtle, as we said before. See, I don't think public school advocates are against parental choice of having folks be able to choose public schools. In general, having public school choice and competition within the public
sector. What makes a private school a bad school? You say parents should be able to choose among public schools, but why shouldn't they be able to choose among all schools?
Well, because it's public money going to a private school. And I think that is a fundamental difference than public money going to a public institution.
But we do that with hospitals. We have public money going to private hospitals.
But private schools already get money, Paul.
Well, so do private hospitals.
Yeah, but that's also a misnomer. Private schools receive public support by not paying taxes, by transportation, by special education, by food. So the government and the public does actually support private education. I mean, I just think that's false, that it doesn't support. And polarizing it is what I'm saying.
Why not have some more of that? And so that parents have a choice from all schools. You're quite right. Public money goes to private schools as well as public schools. Why shouldn't parents have a choice among the full array of schools out there?
I want to go to one argument, and I want to hear what Mayor Norquist says about it. The argument is made, and I think this would be on Peter's side, the so-called creaming argument, that if you set up these vouchers for kids to go to private schools, the kids who are going to go there are the very best kids, and sure, they'll show up well in Paul Peterson's studies, but you're lowering the level of the kids in the other schools, and it's going to make it worse. Here's what John Norquist has to say.
The creaming has already occurred under the public school choice system that we've had in America for the last 35, 40 years. That's where if you have money and kids and you're white, you leave town. That's school choice that you never hear the defenders of the public school monopoly bring up. They're not concerned about that. If somebody leaves town, takes their kids out to the suburbs, and as long as they still send them to a government-run school in the suburbs, that's fine. Who cares? Creaming? Who cares? Anybody care about creaming? No, because they're still in a government-run school.
What do you think? about?
Well, Americans do have the freedom to move. The question is, what's the appropriate solution? And there are elements to what Paul says that I would agree with, so I don't want to overstate this.
I understand.
But it's a fundamental way of restructuring and reorganizing public schools to take resources away from them and give them to private schools. Strikes me as a way that's going to weaken the public schools. The other part about this that I think is really critical, that's sort of overlooked, is that markets are power structures. They don't work the way many of their advocates say they work. And the idea that we're going to get small, great little private schools that are similar to the local Catholic school is yet to be proven. We may get whole other types of schools.
Well, you say it's yet to be proven. Are you in favor of experimentation? I mean, the teachers' unions, for what they consider very good reasons, are against experimentation because precisely they say, okay, suppose Peterson's stuff works.
Yeah.
And it does show that it's good for those kids who go there because of the creaming effect and other effects. Even if the experimentation works, it's going to be bad in a macro sense. So, I mean, are you for experimentation or not?
Oh, I'm for experimentation.
You are.
And I think there's a lot to learn from private education. And that part of Paul's argument I buy.
Well, we probably basically agree because I do not think that we should go from where we are today to a full-blown choice system where you give $10,000 to every parent in the United States tomorrow. I mean, that would be impossible. But what we do need to move from are the small experiments we have had, like in Milwaukee, Cleveland, New York, Washington, all of which are showing pretty good results, to larger scale experiments. Now we're starting to get a larger scale experiment in Milwaukee. 15% of the population can now participate. So we, I think, are getting results from small scale experiments that say kids are learning more in the private schools. As Peter says quite correctly, what if you go to a larger scale development? Then would you get the creaming? We see very little creaming at the present time. The kids in New York are scoring at the 23rd percentile when they come into these private schools. Now 50 is the average, so these kids are way below average. So we're not seeing creaming at this point, but the question is, would you get creaming if you went to a large scale thing? And the only way we can find that out is to start doing it. And the question is not will you get some creaming, but will you get worse creaming than what we have today? Because John Norquist really does make a good point. You never hear the critics of choice condemn the creaming that's going on in the public schools today.
Speaking of John Norquist, he had one other thing, which is another basic argument that's brought up, and Peter, I'd like to go to you about it. Norquist makes the analogy, as many proponents of vouchers do, that there's nothing really wrong with this, about the parochial aspect of it. It's just like the GI Bill of Rights was for the veterans. Let's just hear what he has to say.
Well, under the GI Bill right now, if you were Daddy Warbucks' kids, assuming that you went to serve in the military, you could go to any public, private, or parochial school you want. You could go to Yeshiva University on the GI Bill and become a rabbi. You could go to a theological seminary, become a Catholic priest. Or you could go to the University of Wisconsin, become a communist. Whatever, it's your choice.
I have to tell you that John Norquist is a man who has his eyes set on being governor of the state of Wisconsin. Now, whether that's trashing Madison or is whether that's good politics or not.
Well, he'll get his vote somewhere other than in Madison, I think.
Yeah, right, I suspect.
But you know, the point is pretty well taken.
He is a Democrat, and he is no conservative. It's very interesting and extremely popular in Milwaukee. I mean, that's a political lesson.
There are many of us Democrats supporting school choice, more and more. And in fact, what's really interesting is that black people, especially low-income blacks living in central cities, are supporting choice more than white people living in suburbia for very good reasons.
Let me just go back to Peter. What about Norquist's argument that, hey, it's just like the GI Bill?
Well, I think it's a little different than higher ed. And here's the reasons why I think it is. First off, I think someone 18, 19, 20 years old or older is in a much better position to make choices, and they're mobile. They're able to move around the country. I think that's one thing. The second thing is that it was an incredible demand for education, particularly from 1945 to 1985 or somewhere in there. So there was a big expansion of higher education, so that you still have a stratification effect in higher education, by the way. It's not all just the same. But I think the most important argument that I would make in this regard is that the community school serves many functions for families and for parents and for kids that go beyond simply the academics. They're a social center, they're a cultural center. Athletics can be very important in some communities. They serve as a way of binding a group of people together.
But that's true for the Catholic schools and for many private schools as well.
In fact, you know, that's exactly the point, that it takes a village to make a school. And when we lived in villages, public
there
schools
comes the
worked.
Democrat again. There he goes.
and the village that really exists in the city today is the church and the institutions built around the church. And we should use our institutions that are like villages in big cities to overcome the anomie and alienation that otherwise exists in big cities, and capitalize on that. And that's really what the Catholic message has been to the public schools, is a village can do a better job of educating children.
You said the magic word, which is Catholic. One of the big arguments, particularly by People for the American Way, has been that going into this private school vouchers, particularly when the vouchers go to, when the kids opt to use them in Catholic schools, violates the church-state barrier in the Constitution. Recently, this Milwaukee case came before the Supreme Court, and they refused to rule on it. That is regarded, I want to have your opinion on it, but as a big victory for the voucher people.
Let me just comment on Peter's observations. He made some very good points about the differences between universities and high schools. And he's absolutely right about those points, except none of them has to do anything with the Constitution. The Constitution says there shall be no establishment of religion. Now, choice doesn't establish religion, it just gives money to families, lets them choose a secular school, a communist school if they want, or a Jewish school, or a Catholic school, or a Lutheran school, whatever. That doesn't establish
the late
any
Al
religion.
Shanker, who was a good friend of mine, who was a real visionary on many things in education, one of his big problems with the voucher situation was that you would get communist schools, or schools for witches, or schools for nationalists of one sort or another, or Ku Klux Klan, or whatever. Is that a problem?
Well, I don't think it's a major problem, but yes, it's a problem, because here's what we're missing in this conversation. In some ways, I think it has to do with little children's lives. And part of our responsibility as a community and as a large village, if you will, is to ensure that they have schools that are accountable to the public. So I think there's some danger of that. But to return for a second for the question of the separation of church and state.
And tell me what that court decision means, both of you, briefly, if you could, because we are running out of time.
What I think it means is that the Supreme Court will let this stand and wait probably for another case at some point down the line before making a decision, because this decision will be enormous. We talked about it before. I think it will be as big as Brown, because it will reorganize the system.
As big as Brown versus Board of Education.
Because it will reorganize American education.
That's big.
It's going to be big. So I think they were prudent to wait and to see how this plays out in the next few years.
The justices in Wisconsin, there were 6 of them. 4 said this was constitutional under the federal Constitution and under the Wisconsin Constitution. 2 agreed that it was constitutional under the federal Constitution, but not under the Wisconsin. So every single judge in Wisconsin said this is constitutional under the federal Constitution, and all the judges of the Supreme Court, except for 1, said we don't see any gross violation of the Constitution that requires us to act now. Now, they didn't take up the case, so it's not a final determination, but at least it's not such a gross violation of the Constitution in their eyes that it requires immediate action.
Okay, thank you, Paul Peterson and Peter Cookson, and thank you for Think Tank. I'm Ben Wattenberg.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036, or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at www.pbs.org. And please let us know where you watch Think Tank. This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.